Hound Dog, Elvis Presley, 1956. And as you know, Elvis learned his moves from Forrest Gump.
Hound Dog was pretty simple because I remembered that even being a real little kid, I remember that as being like one of the most famous and one of the earliest Elvis hits.
Elvis learned the song from a couple of other sources. It was Big Mama Willie Mae Thornton who performed it as a straight-out blues song written by Lieber and Stoller. And later on, Elvis in Las Vegas saw a nightclub act called Freddie Bell and his Bellboys, and they were the ones who did it sort of rock and roll style, and that's what Elvis emulated.
And I said, hey, guess what? He says, what? I said, we got this gigantic hit. He said, really? What is that? And I said, Hound Dog. He said, oh, you mean the old Big Mama Thornton record? I said, no. I said, some new white kid did it, named Elvis Presley. He said, Elvis who?
Here's Rebel Rouser by Duane Eddy, 1958. This is, I guess, the first running scene in Forrest Gump because he's running away from a pack of hoodlums.
We had a category of instrumentals as well, along with regionals and favorite artists and stuff.
So, Joel suggested that it might be, some Duane Eddy type thing. So I started looking at the list and I said, well, let's try this. It's got the word rebel in the title. We're in the South.
Now, Duane Eddy also had another song, another hit later on called 40 Miles of Bad Road. And I guess Forrest Gump ran some of those too. I don't know why I love you, but I do. Clarence Frogman Henry, 1961. A perfect song to reflect the South in Forrest Gump.
It reflected what was going on in the scene. It was kind of like, it echoed from what Forrest was thinking about Jenny and what Jenny was really thinking about Forrest.
One time I was in New Orleans and went to a nightclub that was owned by Clarence Frogman Henry on Bourbon Street. So I had the fortune of meeting him and telling him how much I loved his song. And he walked over to his jukebox, dropped a dime in, and played the song and then sang it live to me.
I only know I'm lonely and that I want you only. I don't know why I love you, but I do.
Priceless. Walk Right In, the Rooftop Singers, 1963. Jenny in Forrest Gump wanted to be a folk singer. So this song reflects and represents some of the folk hits of that period by the Rooftop Singers, by Peter, Paul, and Mary, by the Kingston Trio, and of course Trini Lopez. And If I Had a Hammer, we all remember that, don't we?
I wanted some music to be representative of where Jenny's head was at. And of course, we were still in the early 60s. It was sort of like pre-hippie, she was kind of into the folk singing bohemian thing that was going on. But I wanted it to be something that would be on the radio.
I thought it was perfectly used in the beginning of this era, because it was in the very beginning. And I think it set a tone because it moved, and it sort of was an up-tempo thing, and it was quite different than like past folk things. It was more jazz-oriented and more drums and bass and all that kind of thing.
Sugar Shack, Jimmy Gilmer and the Fireballs, 1963. Jimmy Gilmer, a band out of New Mexico. And this is a perfect song to match the moment in the movie where Forrest Gump has his kind of sexual awakening. The Fireballs didn't score again, well, pardon the pun, until a few years later, maybe 5 years later, with Bottle of Wine. I think Forrest could have used that too. Hanky Panky by Tommy James and the Shondells, 1966, a #1 song for the band, and it's used to in a scene in which some people are getting into some hanky panky at a nightclub where Jenny is working. Blowin' in the Wind, a Bob Dylan song by Joan Baez, sung in the movie by the Jenny character.
She says in the movie, I want to be, famous like Joan Baez, so. That was a natural. That one we knew, when we read the script, that's what she would be singing.
Now, in real life, on recordings, it was recorded by, of course, Bob Dylan, but also by a wide range of artists, ranging from Peter, Paul, and Mary to Stevie Wonder. And in fact, it inspired an answer song, another song about the need for equality, written by Sam Cooke. And it was called A Change Is Gonna Come. Land of a Thousand Dances, Cannibal and the Headhunters, 1965. One of the great all-time frat party songs.
It just says exactly what it is. Land of a Thousand Dances. It's the right song for something coming out of a topless bar.
It was covered by Wilson Pickett, the Wicked Pickett, the following year. Big hit. Fortunate Son, Creedence Clearwater Revival, 1969. John Fogerty of Creedence said he was never really a political guy, but he said he served in the Army and had strong feelings about the fact that poor, disenfranchised people were quite often the ones who were more likely to be drafted into military service. He thought that was kind of unfair, and he thought of this song as his own personal confrontation with President Nixon.
I just knew that song. You know, I knew it. It's been in my brain ever since I heard it. When it first came out, and that was the first choice. Played it up, put up against the picture. Worked like gangbusters. We knew we had to. I mean, couldn't think of anything better.
I Can't Help Myself, Sugar Pie Honey Bunch, The Four Tops, 1965.
That was playing in the set on the day, and that really was a powerful thing, yeah, with helicopters flying over and all the soldiers, and having that just rock and roll Motown music playing in the background was, we all felt like we were there.
But through it all, this particular music, I like to think that it had a calming effect on the nation, because no matter what was going on, we always stuck to our love themes, and it'll be all right in the morning.
That's Levi Stubbs and the Four Tops' #1 song for Motown. They had one other one, Reach Out, I'll Be There. Here's Respect, Aretha Franklin, 1967. This song was written by Otis Redding, who recorded it himself. And Aretha Franklin recorded this during a week-long session for her first Atlantic Records album. And Tom Dowd, the engineer, was just amazed at how fast she worked. He said she would just sit down at the piano, play the song, record it, done. Rainy Day Women, 12 and 35, Bob Dylan, 1966. Now, strangely enough, Bob recorded this one at the Columbia Studios in Nashville, and he told a session musician, Charlie McCoy, that he, for whatever reason, wanted a Salvation Army kind of a sound. And so McCoy brought in a slide trombone for the session, and Dylan finished it in just 17 minutes, one take. Sloop John B., The Beach Boys, 1966. The Beach Boys were one of the few American male groups to kind of weather the British invasion from a couple of years before, and they did it on a diet of songs about surfing and cars and California girls. But here in 1966, they began to broaden their palette with the folk song, Sloop John B.
We said, well, we got Motown music playing, we should have some Beach Boys here too. Some guys be playing some Beach Boys music, and we played some different songs against it, and Sloop John B. Felt the best.
You know there was somebody from California out there wishing that they had their surfboard and, a doobie and their girlfriend, and instead, they're there.
All Along the Watchtower, Jimi Hendrix Experience, 1968, and this accompanies Private Gump and his fellow soldiers on patrol in the fields and paths of Vietnam.
I wanted some big, loud, music to just smash us into a place where, suddenly, they're in the real war. I mean, Forrest has now got his equipment, he's carrying a gun, and the suggestion was, well, what about those opening chords of All Around the Watchtower? And we put that in the machine, and it was perfect.
And this was Jimi Hendrix's only top 40 hit, amazingly enough. Even Purple Haze didn't make it. Soul Kitchen, The Doors, 1967. This one accompanies the soldiers still going through various parts of Vietnam on patrol, but it was actually inspired by a restaurant in Venice Beach outside Los Angeles where the Doors often hung out and ate. California Dreamin', the Mamas and the Papas, 1966, and this is about as literal as you can get. John Phillips and Michelle Phillips are living out of a funky hotel room in New York City where all the leaves are brown and the sky is gray, and they're thinking about California.
And he said, listen to this, I'm writing a song. All the leaves are brown and the sky is gray. I've been for a walk on a winter's day. He says, well, I said, it's beautiful, John, it's beautiful. He says, well, get up, help me write it.
It refers to specifically what Jenny's dreaming about, but it works great, and it's just so melancholy with these guys, you know, trying to sleep in the rain and the mud of Vietnam.
For what it's worth, Buffalo Springfield, 1967. This is pretty ambiguous as political statements go, but sometimes that's the best kind of a protest song so that a person can apply it to whatever event or incident he or she might like. In this particular case, Stephen Stills and Neil Young, who were two of the leaders of Springfield, said that they were inspired by the Sunset Strip riots of the mid-60s when police were trying to clear the huge crowds that thronged along Sunset Strip.
Another classic anthem of the unrest that was going on in the 60s, but it just was emotionally perfect for when we started that sequence.
What the world needs now is love, sweet love. Jackie DeShannon, 1965, a real gentle protest song written by Burt Bacharach and Hal David, and Jackie DeShannon had the hit with it. It was also recorded by Dionne Warwick. Now, Jackie herself was a fine songwriter, and her own song was another gentle protest song, Put a Little Love in Your Heart. Break on through to the other side, The Doors, 1967. This is actually part of a montage of Doors songs along with Hello, I Love You, and People Are Strange.
I've always been like a major Doors fan my whole life, so I knew all the Doors songs, and I just started playing the Doors up against the Images, and that one seemed to work perfectly with the sort of rhythm that Forrest was playing ping pong. It was like too perfect.
The Doors rhythm and the sound of the ping pong balls going back and forth set up a whole new kind of rhythmic structure, and I thought, this is excellent. This is what music and cinema is all about, the marriage of the two things, a perfect juxtaposition.
When we first approached them to license the 3 songs for the ping pong sequence, they had said, no, we could only have one.
So finally, Joel, in all of our frustration, he said, well, look, if you've got the nerve, and I think we should do it, let's just screen it for the surviving Doors and just see what they say. So he said, well, okay. So we screened it. The word came back, not only can you use the 3 songs, go ahead and put Doors songs wherever you want in this movie.
I remember that the Doors told me, or at least Ray Manzarek told me, that Break On Through didn't break on into the charts despite their best efforts. In fact, the Doors trooped down to the offices of Elektra Records one evening and sat at telephones and called a DJ at a radio station to request their own song. So they would disguise their voices and everything, but it didn't work. Fortunately, their next single was Light My Fire. Mrs. Robinson, Simon and Garfunkel, 1968. And here's to you, Mr. Gump, as you get your Medal of Honor. You know, one time, Paul Simon told the story about being on the Dick Cavett show, and one of his fellow guests was Mickey Mantle of the Yankees. And during a commercial break, Mickey turned to Paul and said, hey, that Mrs. Robinson, why didn't you use my name? And Paul Simon said, oh, well, it was just a matter of syllables, you know? It was just the way the song broke. And so it really wasn't a personal statement on whether or not Mickey or Joe deserved to be in the song more, but DiMaggio just fit. Volunteers, Jefferson Airplane, 1969. Well, this is really a perfect song to go along with a protest scene in the street. But the thing is, it began with Marty Balin of the Jefferson Airplane up in the mansion in which, the big house in which the airplane all kind of lived.
And one morning I was disturbed from a hangover by these cans being rattled and thrown around on the street outside the window, and I opened it up and there was a Volunteers of America truck out there, you know, picking up this stuff, and I just leaned over and wrote, you know, hey, look what's happening in the street, you know. Got a revolution, Volunteers of America, you know, the whole thing. And then that day I gave it to Paul and said, hey, you know, maybe you can use this. And then that night he, at rehearsal, had the music to it. And we started doing it, and it took on a political connotation for people.
But it's really just about garbage being noisy down from Marty's bedroom. Hey Joe, Jimi Hendrix Experience, 1967. You know, this is a slowed-down version by Jimi Hendrix of the original tune as done by The Leaves, a kind of a garage band out of Northridge, California. They did not have the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Where Have All the Flowers Gone? Kingston Trio, 1962. This is heard and sung outside the White House in Forrest Gump. This, along with We Shall Overcome and Blowin' in the Wind, were pretty much the songs you often heard or even sang along to at all the various civil rights and anti-war protests of the early to mid-60s. Get Together, The Youngbloods, 1969. This is as close as there is to an anthem of the so-called hippie generation, recorded by a number of bands, including the Jefferson Airplane and We Five. I think they both had hits with it.
We selected the Get Together because when Jenny was sort of playing, again, it was like, where would her folk singing have evolved to, or her, you know, and of course now she's hitchhiking and she's begging on the streets of Hollywood Boulevard, and we thought it would be appropriate that she be singing Get Together.
It was written by Dino Valenti, who actually, sadly, had to sell the publishing rights to his song for just a small amount of money to bail himself out of jail on a drug bust. He later on went to join Quicksilver Messenger Service, and he advised rock fans to just take another hit of Fresh Air, which is much cheaper and I think legal. San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear Flowers in Your Hair, Scott McKenzie, 1967. This was a song that was written for the people who were planning to attend the Monterey Pop Festival in Northern California in June of 1967. The singer Scott McKenzie told his buddy John Phillips about the fact that maybe there should be a song about this.
I remember it as a process. I think John and I talked about the idea for the song for a couple of weeks at least, and then he just sort of sat down and went into his own position and whatever it was and wrote the song in about 20 minutes.
About 20 minutes. It was the first time Lou heard the song. He said, God, we got to do this song immediately. And we went in the studio the next day, I think, and recorded it, which was a Tuesday. And by Friday, it was on the radio. And by Monday, it was a hit. I mean, it was just
Turn, 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 The Byrds, 1965. And this is another song by the great Pete Seeger, based on a poem that appeared in the King James Version of the Bible.
In ancient Hebrew and in many traditions, a poem is a poem because it has things repeated, like that opening to everything, a time for this, a time for that, a time for the time, a time. And that word is repeated. That makes it a poem.
The words are timeless. They're from Ecclesiastes, and the melody is a simple melody, but a very melodic one. And I think my love of Pete Seeger and his way of performing inspired me to want to do anything that he wrote.
It's so unassuming and so unpretentious and so clear, you know. It just translated into our thing, you know, it hit our chemistry perfectly.
Pete added the phrase, turn, 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 and then in the line, time for peace, he adds the words, I swear it's not too late.
A wonderful song, so reflective of a mood.
Joel and I knew that that song was going to be in the movie somewhere, and we weren't quite sure where we were going to put it, and we knew it was going to be in that phase of, you know, because it was the time it had to be right.
So Pete Seeger embellishing a poem and making it a folk rock standard. Aquarius, Let the Sun Shine In, Fifth Dimension, 1969. This is from the musical Hair, of course, a mashup of two songs that worked really well.
We were so excited about that song. All 5 of us were saying, "Did you hear that song? We've got to record that song."
Right.
So we called our producer, Bones Howe, and we said, "Bones, we've heard this song. We've got to record it. We think it's a #1 record." And so Bones said, "Well, you know, the song's been recorded a few times." He said, "and nobody's been able to make a hit out of it. Well, let me think about it."
It was a #1 record for 6 weeks in 1969. Members of the Fifth Dimension were thrilled that their song was used to match the moon landing scene in Forrest Gump.
That was a song that I just knew had some kind of resonance to setting us in some time. It was the age of Aquarius. I said, I just knew that we had to make a reference to that.
Joy to the World, Three Dog Night, 1971. In the early 70s, the world is beginning to come to accord with China. This song was written by Hoyt Axton, whose mother, Mae Boren Axton, actually was in the music business too, and she wound up with a writing credit on a song that was done by and became the first big hit for one of Forrest Gump's co-stars, the first musician he meets in the movie, Elvis Presley. You do remember Heartbreak Hotel. Everybody's Talking, Nilsson, 1969. One of the great unsung artists of his era, Harry Nilsson. His big moment came when this very song was used in the 1969 movie, Midnight Cowboy. In fact, the scene in Forrest Gump in which the song is used is kind of a tip of the cap to that movie.
When Forrest is like wheeling Lieutenant Dan through the traffic, it just kind of haunts back to Ratso Rizzo and John Voight cruising through New York and the song playing. And it was just terrific. I mean, I couldn't believe Bob pulled that off. It's so great.
Stoned Love, The Supremes, 1970. This was a call for peace and love in a time of war. For the Supremes, it was their last top 10 hit, although they did stay together until 1972. Love Her Madly, The Doors, 1971. Well, by 1971, the Doors were pretty near the end. In fact, this is from their last studio album called L.A. Woman. It did generate a couple more hits for them, though, Love Her Madly and Riders on the Storm. And then Jim Morrison was off to Paris, never to return. Let's Work Together, Wilbert Harrison, 1970, a song that accompanies a wild party scene in Forrest Gump. Wilbert Harrison, his first hit was Kansas City a number of years before this one, and then this one became so popular it was covered by a lot of different bands, including Canned Heat, Brian Ferry, and even the Kentucky Headhunters. Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head, 1970, B.J. Thomas, who has said that this Burt Bacharach song was a favorite of President Lyndon B. Johnson's and was heard around the White House. Well, LBJ, of course, was one of Forrest Gump's co-stars.
And I've always been real proud of the fact that it was Burt Bacharach's first gold record. And I already had 4 gold records, and of course he was 10 times the star that I ever became. But I was very proud of the fact that I had his first gold record.
Tie a Yellow Ribbon, Tony Orlando and Dawn, 1973. You know how people and organizations use different colored ribbons to signify causes? Pink ribbon, yellow ribbon, a blue ribbon? It has come to symbolize the hope that people have for the safe return of loved ones from afar. It became particularly popular in the early 90s during the Gulf War, and so from war to war, from Forrest Gump's Vietnam to the wars of today, the yellow ribbon continues to tie people and their hopes together. Get Down Tonight, KC and the Sunshine Band, 1976, and this goes along with some illicit drug use in the film Forrest Gump. Hard to imagine that going on in any discotheque, of course. Now, Richard Finch of KC and the Sunshine Band told me once that the band got song ideas just from listening to their audience. So I guess someone at one point said, "Get down," and I guess at some other point said, "Shake your booty." Well, songs come from anywhere, even the dance floor. Freebird, Leonard Skinner, 1975, and Jenny is on the ledge and on the edge.
And it was real touching where they put Freebird was too, because that's really the only song that could have fit there. She was a Freebird, you know, that's what it was about, and you couldn't change her, and she wasn't about to change, so.
Actually, Leonard Skinner wrote the song in tribute to a fellow Southern rocker, the late Duane Allman. Mr. President, have pity on the working man. Randy Newman, 1974. Now, this was not a hit. Randy Newman had very few, in fact, only one commercial hit record, and that would be Short People.
For some visceral reason, you just put Randy Newman up against that section of the picture, and it just works. And Mr. President seemed to be lyrically the right song for what was going on at the picture at the time.
People just loved his acerbic, dry, sarcastic, sardonic sense of humor, and his general wit applied both to people and society at large. Sweet Home Alabama, Leonard Skinner, 1974. The band just loved the fact that in Forrest Gump, this song is used to accompany the first dance between Forrest and Jenny.
Turned out to be the perfect song for the two of them to be listening to when they were together in Alabama. And that's, it was the right time. We know that it would have been played on the radio all the time. And it felt right. And it's sort of like, again, it's sort of an anthem.
They were in the studio in New York City making this album with Al Cooper, the producer and musician. And at one point during the session, John Lennon, who was working nearby, popped into the studio to ask for some advice from Al Cooper. So Al spoke with him and John left. And one of the band members said, was that John Lennon? And Al said, yeah, it was. And the guy said, I think we need to take a break. Running on Empty, Jackson Browne, 1978, and this is a perfect kickoff song as Forrest begins his long run around the country.
The image of Forrest Gump running down, just running and keeping running, and then actually being okay with just running and keep, not worrying about, where he'd been or where he's going is, it's a great metaphor for how we get through our lives.
I've always loved that song, and I thought it was just so appropriate in its lyrics, and I thought it was perfect for the time in chronology, and so and it just sort of kicked off Forrest's run in a really energetic way, and that was one that I always thought of early on.
Jackson Browne has said that this is simply a song about running out of gas, running out of options, not knowing where you're headed, but maintaining nonetheless, just carrying on. It Keeps You Running, the Doobie Brothers, 1977. And this is, again, perfect accompaniment on the long run that Forrest Gump is on. And the Doobie Brothers themselves had a pretty good run. They had 16 hit records in their 17 years together, and this was one of their first hits after Michael McDonald joined them in 1976. I've Got to Use My Imagination, Gladys Knight and the Pips, 1974, and this is co-written by one of the great rock and roll songwriters of all time, Jerry Goffin, who, of course, worked with Carole King and produced a Hall of Fame full of hit records. Here he is working with Barry Goldberg, who is a blues artist and a member of Electric Flag.
We sat down, Jerry sat down in my living room. I said, come on, Jerry, please. So he sits down, and he starts writing on a little paper, and like 10 minutes later, he shows me the lyrics. He says, is this what you want? And I read the lyrics to Imagination. It just blew me away. I said, yeah, thanks a lot,
This is one of their first commercial efforts. They wrote a lot of political songs together, but decided maybe it's time to get commercial, and they came up with Imagination. Big hit for Gladys Knight and the Pips.
Sometimes there are songs that, don't come from, it's just the syntax, of the song, and the idea that sort of carry you through it.
Go Your Own Way, Fleetwood Mac, 1977. Now, Perfect Strangers are joining Forrest Gump now on his run around the country. And the song, though, was really just a personal statement by the members of Fleetwood Mac. They were all going through dysfunction, personal relationships, breakups of those relationships, while they were making their album called Rumors in 1977. On the Road Again, Willie Nelson, 1980, and a big crossover, maybe the only country crossover hit for Willie, and On the Road Again is pretty much the story of his life. You know, I met Willie for a magazine profile in the mid-'80s, and he told me that he himself was a jogger, just like Forrest Gump. But I think that's pretty much where the resemblances ended.
That was when the beginning of the resurgence of the country and Western country rock music started in that period of the late 70s. And I mean, Willie Nelson was like one of the biggest stars, and we wanted to set the time, and of course, Forrest was on the road again.
Against the Wind, Bob Seger, 1980, one last song for the running sequence and for the Forrest Gump film.
Well, two things happen there. One is that the movie catches up with real time. In other words, at the end of that scene, it's where we're no longer in the past with Forrest. So we don't know where in the film we're going now. Forrest doesn't know. So we're following him now in real time.
Bob Seger has talked about the song being about what happens after you hit success, have a peak of success, and you're starting to wonder, what is next?